Have you ever invited a family or a group of people to your house, maybe for a meal, and then you get to cleaning the house and cooking the meal, and you wonder, why did I do this? Put your answer in the comments. Have you ever invited a group over, and then when you're doing all the necessary stuff, have you ever wondered, why did I do this? Okay, Jeannie Stone says yes, she has done that. Tina Fraser says, maybe. Okay. Phyllis says yes. Tina Price says yes. Blake, yes. Mike and Linda King, yes, that's probably Linda. So a lot of you have said yes. Well, we're going to talk about that in a little bit. I'm going to have to quit reading everybody's comments so I can do the sermon. And I think Mary Lynn is looking at all this. So, hey, Wakas, good morning over in Pakistan. Glad you're all here today. So, I want to read from 1 Peter chapter 4, and I'm going to read verses 8 through 10. And the reason I'm doing this is because on Foundations with Frank, we've been going through the book of 1 Peter. And it just applies to all Christians. And we've already talked about this part on our Foundations with Frank. But I wanted all of us to study this together. And this is going to be a little bit more in depth than it was on Foundations with Frank. So let me turn to it in my Bible just to make sure that I'm reading it properly and correctly. 1 Peter chapter 4, and beginning with verse 8, he says, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each one should use whatever gift he has received to serve others faithfully, administering God's grace in its various forms. So the first thing in those 3 verses is that we're all called to love each other deeply. That's the word that Peter used here. We are to love each other deeply. That means that it's not a superficial kind of thing. It's not a superficial kind of thing, okay? So it's something that we got to ask ourselves, how can I do that? How can I even love people that I really don't know that well? Well, first of all, we've got to understand the definition of love. It is not that you love people like you do your earthly family or your best friends. It just simply means that you care about another person's situation, physically, spiritually, financially. It just means that we want what is best for other people. And we have to prove that by what we do and what we say. Okay? So that's how this works. Now, how are we as human beings able to do that? Well, in Matthew 22, beginning with verse 37, Jesus replied. Somebody asked him what the greatest commandment was. And we're going to talk about this in a lot more depth later on in another sermon. Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. And here is the deal. I don't think that we can love other people properly, especially people that are not really close to us, unless we're in the right relationship with God through Jesus, loving Him properly because He first loved us. Okay, so that is the key thing here, is be in the right relationship with God so we can be in the right relationship with others. The love that we have for God should overflow into our relationship with other people. Now, Jesus taught us in these verses in Matthew that loving God and loving our neighbors are inseparable. You cannot love other people the way you need to unless you love God the way you need to. When we truly love others, we are compelled to serve them selflessly. That's the way Jesus did us. When He left heaven, He was not thinking of Himself. He was thinking of you and me and everybody else in the world. The problem with us in the United States of America is we think more of ourselves than we do anyone else. And if that is my case and your case, we're not going to love people the way we should. So what we've got to do is get back to the right relationship with God so we can get into the right relationship with other people. Now, here's another thing that I want to call your attention to. He says, above all, love each other deeply because love covers over a multitude of sins. When you really love somebody, you will tend to overlook many of their shortcomings. How many of you have had a family member do something and you overlook it, but somebody else can do the same thing and you rant and rave about it? Has that ever happened to you? Or am I the only heathen among us this morning? You know, I think we all do that. We all look over some things that people do that we have a relationship with and that we love. But we don't overlook it with people that we don't love. So, the first thing that he says is to love each other deeply, because love overlooks the shortcomings in other people. Now let me ask you another question. Are you glad that God overlooked your shortcomings and mine and those of people thousands of years ago and sent His Son to save us anyway? He sent His Son to save us, even though we were in opposition to Him. So let me encourage you. Ask God to help you to be more like Him, to love like He does. Okay? Now, the second thing that I want you to see is the second point here. He says that we are to offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Years ago, I read a story of a family who had invited a bunch of people over for a meal. And when they all gathered around the table, the dad asked the 6 or 8 year old little boy to give thanks for the food. And so as he prayed, he thanked God for the food and all that. And then he said, and dear God, please help Mom figure out why on earth she invited all these people to dinner. So you see, I asked you that question to begin with, but this little guy spilled the beans on his mother during the prayer. Sometimes we overload ourselves. We go to the opposite extreme from doing nothing to doing more than we should. And so sometimes when that happens, sometimes we grumble about it. Now, Romans 12:13 says, share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. You know, back in Jesus' day, there weren't motels everywhere and things like that. And so when people would come into a town, they'd go to the public square and someone would come and invite them to stay with them. Even in our country years ago, that's how people traveled. If they couldn't make it to a town traveling on horseback, if they come to a house, they would stop and see if they could have supper with them and stay with them. And so I want to encourage you to think about what is being hospitable today. What does that look like to you? As a matter of fact, I want you to put your answer in the comments. Just a one or two or three word answer. What does it mean to you to be hospitable? To practice hospitality. What does that look like to you? Sometimes it's entertaining guests, but sometimes it's about creating an atmosphere of love and caring for the people around us. As believers, we're called to practice hospitality without grumbling or without hesitation. So, what I would really like for all of us to do is, if we have a spouse, sit down and have a conversation about how can we, as a couple, practice hospitality. Yeah, Martha Burke put in here offering meals, serving people in need. I know that a group of ladies from our church is baking cookies, and they're going to be delivering them to several places. I don't know if it's this coming week or when it is. Yeah, Tina Price said her mom always said, my door's always open. And that's great. And that's the attitude that we do need to have. Now, when you and I can practice hospitality without grumbling or without hesitation, what we're doing to other people is we are reflecting God's love to them. How do people know what God is like if they're not a Christian and they've never read the Bible? How do they know what God's like? Well, the only way they're going to know is by watching you and watching me. So when you and I are hospitable, we show God's love to them. And we create a welcoming environment where others can experience God's grace. They do that. They experience God's grace through you and through me. God works through His children. He doesn't thunder something down from heaven. He does it through you and through me. Waqas Musa's on here today from Pakistan. And there are a group of men, women, and children who are what you could call modern day slaves at the brick kilns in Pakistan. And they live in company housing, and they have company health care. And once they get hooked up there, they can never leave because they always owe the company more than they make. And Wakas and his family and other Christians take clothing and food and all kinds of things, and they go teach them about Jesus. That's being hospitable. That is showing God's love. That is demonstrating God's grace. And that's simply what I want us to do, is to demonstrate God's grace to people who have never experienced it, okay? Now, this is why we need to break the church down into smaller groups. It's so we can get to know one another. You're not going to get to know people on Sunday morning with 100 people around. But when we break it down into smaller groups, then that's how we get to know people, and we can be more hospitable with one another. Now, the last thing is this, is the third thing that comes from these verses, and that is he wants us to use our gifts to serve. He said each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms, which simply means we all have different gifts. Now, in 1 Corinthians 12, beginning with verse 4, here's what Paul said about it. He said there are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit gives them or distributes them. There are different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of working, but in all of them and in everyone, it is the same God at work. Now to each one, he says, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. Paul said it was for the common good. You and I, we need to be serving others. We need to be hospitable to others, but other people need to be doing the same thing for us. Paul said everybody that's a Christian has received these gifts for the common good, for everyone's good. God has uniquely gifted each of us for a purpose. Each of us for a specific purpose, to do a specific job in the church. And we're called to use our gifts to serve others faithfully. So when we lean into or embrace our roles as stewards of God's grace, then we contribute to the growth and the building up of the body of Christ. That's how church grows. By people like you and people like me demonstrating God's love and grace to those who have never experienced it. Our service to others becomes an expression of God's love. And it really is our testimony. It's really our testimony. You don't have to get up on a Sunday morning and give a 3 or 5 minute testimony. What you and I do with the gifts that God has given us, that is our testimony. Now, here's what I simply want us all to see. We are saved to serve. We're saved to serve. Even Jesus himself said, for the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. If Jesus came to serve, I don't think it's beneath me, I don't think it's beneath you to do the same thing. Now, through the power of God's love, we are called to love deeply, practice hospitality without grumbling, and to use our gifts to serve others faithfully. And as we fulfill this calling, we become vessels of God's grace. And we shine His light into a world that desperately needs it. Don't you think our world needs to learn about the love and grace of God? If you see the news at all, you know that things are getting worse and worse instead of better and better. So, here is so what? You know, after, when you're teaching a lesson or preaching a sermon, at the end of it, you just need to ask, so what? What does this matter? Well, here's my so what today. I want you to pray about starting a small group where you can get to know other people, so you can be hospitable, so you can use the gifts that God has given you to serve others. Now, when I'm talking about small group, I'm talking about you and from 3 to 6 other people. I'm not talking about 25 people. I'm talking about you and maybe 3 to 6 other people. Where do you meet? Well, you can invite them to your house. But if you don't want to have to clean the house, then you can meet at a restaurant somewhere and have dessert or have a meal. Or if you really want to start a small group and you don't have a place, I will find you a place. I will find you a place to meet. So here's what I want you to do. I want you and your spouse, if you have one, to discuss and to pray about beginning a small group. And I will help you in any way. And do you know it, when you start a small group, that doesn't mean that you have to teach a lesson. Maybe you invite someone else who will do a 10 or 15-minute lesson. And you just spend the rest of the time getting to know one another and liking each other. But here's what I do know. To effectively serve our community, we've got to break the large congregation down into smaller units. And do you know your group of 4 to 8 people, 10 people, could do things together to show hospitality, to show God's love and God's grace to others. So, may the love of God fill our hearts and overflow into every aspect of our lives. And may we find joy and fulfillment in serving others. Because we need to know that when we're doing that, we're participating in God's redemptive work. We're participating in God saving others. May His grace empower us to be faithful stewards of the gifts that He's entrusted to each of us. I hope we'll all get together and pray, and all of us that can, not everybody can have a small group in their home. They got to be somebody left to go to the small group. But here's what I do know. Most of us need to get out of our comfort zone of hanging around with the same people every week and invite another person or two to come into our group. That's what we need to do. Hey, everybody. Thanks for being with me today.